The opinions expressed in the State of Mind program are those of the speakers. The program is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not a substitute for consulting a medical or mental health professional. Welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, broadcasting on KSQD Santa Cruz on 90.7 FM and live streaming at ksqd.org. I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Today, we're going to be talking with our guests about gender-based violence, which involves acts of violence committed against women, men, boys, and girls as a result of social norms about roles and behavior expected of each gender. These are acts that inflict physical, mental, or sexual harm or suffering. This umbrella term includes the more familiar descriptors of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and dating violence. Why are we here talking about this subject today? Because every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. 1 in every 3 girls in the U.S. is a victim of physical, verbal, or emotional abuse. Teens and young adults are particularly vulnerable to dating violence, and these relationships can be as abusive and dangerous as those of adults. Additionally, gender-based violence is rampant on college campuses. Among undergraduate students, 26% of females and nearly 7% of males experience rape or sexual assault, and more than half of these assaults will occur at this time of year, from August to November, just as students are returning to campuses across the country. And most of these crimes will go unreported. Only 20%, 1 in 5 female student victims between the ages of 18 and 24, report to law enforcement. And the mental health impacts for survivors of gender-based violence include post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, substance misuse, self-harm, suicidal behavior, and sleep disturbances. Survivors may also face stigma and rejection from community and family. This is such an important and impactful problem across our country and around the world. With us today to discuss gender-based violence support and prevention are 2 Walnut Avenue Family and Women's Center educators and advocates, Nick Laughlin and Ana Velasquez. Also with us is survivor and now domestic violence hotline volunteer, Nat, who will only be using his first name. Everyone on the show today is recording from remote locations, so please forgive any sound quality issues that may arise. Listeners, please be aware that in this show we'll be discussing parental, partner, dating, and other forms of abuse. However, our community educator guests strongly suggest that you consider listening to this show along with your teens. It should provide you with some important things to talk about in order to help your teen be more aware, more prepared, and more capable of keeping themselves safe. Let me tell you more about our guests today. Nick Laughlin uses pronouns they, theirs, and is a youth and domestic violence advocate. They have a background in adolescent substance use recovery. In their current role at Walnut Avenue Family and Women's Center, Nick brings presentations about healthy relationships and teen dating to hundreds of young people across Santa Cruz County. Additionally, Nick provides free one-on-one mentoring with young people and leads a free trauma-informed child care program. Both programs work to be gender-affirming, anti-racist, and LGBTQ+ safer spaces for all youth, with a focus on increasing resiliency. Nick's lifelong passion is working with and learning from young people. Ana Velasquez, pronouns she, her, is a bilingual prevention specialist at the Walnut Avenue Family and Women's Center. It was through her time, first as a volunteer and later as an advocate, that she discovered her passion for working with Spanish-speaking survivors of domestic violence and for supporting and empowering young people in making informed decisions about their lives. In her current role, Anna is a frequent speaker and educator in the community on the topics of domestic violence prevention and healthy relationships. Anna also provides one-on-one mentoring to youth in addition to supervising the agency's youth group, which provides a safe space for youth to build community, have fun, and have opportunities to have tough conversations. Anna's goal is to help lift up youth voices to ensure that they receive the material and emotional support they need to thrive. Nat, pronouns he, him, is a writer and activist currently living in Santa Cruz, California. After going to graduate school for a master's degree in English, he started a service year as the AmeriCorps VIP lead at the Volunteer Center of Santa Cruz County. He is also a domestic violence hotline advocate with Walnut Avenue Family and Women's Center and a transgender and non-binary support group facilitator at the Diversity Center. We're so glad to have these guests here with us to help us learn more about gender-based violence. So please join me in welcoming Anna, Nick, and Nat.
Yes, thank you so much.
Pleased to be here.
So Anna, I'm thinking we'll start with you. I can imagine as listeners hear those national statistics, they might be thinking, okay, yeah, I understand that's the national problem, but how big is the problem here in Santa Cruz? And I'm wondering, could you talk about, to what extent those statistics might actually apply here in our community?
Well, those statistics are reflective of what is happening, not just in our community, but in other communities throughout the state and even throughout the country. Based on the numbers of folks that we serve, that definitely seems to indicate that the problem is as big or even bigger than it is being widely reported in the statistics. One of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of people do not come forward either to law enforcement or to gender-based violence professionals like ourselves in Walnut Avenue and other organizations to seek help for a variety of reasons. One of the other things to also be mindful of is that just because we and the general public are not seeing some of these phenomena of gender-based violence, of sexual assault, of family violence happening, that doesn't mean that it's non-existent. One of the things we all want to keep in mind is that we have no idea what happens behind closed doors. Not only that, but there's been plenty of cases both locally and nationwide of families that seem to have everything going for them, only for those families to then find themselves in a situation where a domestic violence homicide happened, where the person that was being harmed in a domestic violence situation was murdered by their partner. And then sometimes it might not be just them, but their children. There have been a couple prominent cases. There was a case out of Aptos that happened not too long ago. That was a domestic violence homicide. There have also been a couple of other cases in nearby Monterey County. So, and those are typically the cases that capture the headlines and bring people's attention to this problem. But one of the things that we all need to remember is that not all cases are going to have such a tragic and dramatic conclusion as those cases. And so because they're not going to have that vividness, right, and that brutality, they're not going to capture the headlines. We're not going to hear about it in the newspapers, on the radio, or on social media. Again, unless somebody decides to bring it to light, whether it's the folks in the media, journalists, or if it's somebody coming forward in social media, sharing their story and it going viral.
And so just for listeners, because that term gender-based violence might be new to them, is there a way in which you'd want to describe everything that includes?
Yes, so gender-based violence is a term that refers to harmful actions or behaviors that are directed at a person based on their gender or sexual orientation. This is a term that is very commonly used in the human rights community, whether it's the UN or even human rights groups and activist spaces. One of the things to um, think about when it comes to gender-based violence is that this includes a broad spectrum of behaviors that encompass things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental and emotional abuse, financial abuse that are inflicted either in public or in private spaces. The victims can essentially be anyone. This issue cuts across racial and class uh, lines. It could happen to anybody, but of course, one of the things that we want to consider when we are thinking about gender-based violence and who it impacts is that depending on somebody's identity and whether they're part of one or multiple marginalized groups in our society, that may put them at a higher risk in comparison to somebody that is part of the dominant group in society who maybe has a little bit more opportunities to access resources and support than people from marginalized communities. The other thing that puts folks at potential higher risk is if they have a prior history of domestic violence exposure or having been on the receiving end.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah. Nat, I understand you've been a victim, and I'm wondering if you could share with us what happened to you and what kind of gender-based violence you experienced.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I got into a relationship with this person that seemed okay at the time. And it turned out we were together for 4 years. So this went into my early college years as well. And it turned out he was super coercive, abusive, manipulative. And I didn't have trust in the adults around me at the time that I could like say something to them about this and actually be heard without being told immediately, like, oh, just break up with him, or like, why are you with him, or something like that. And so I kind of just kept it to myself and let it continue, which of course led to it getting worse. So there were a lot of things like just a lot of gaslighting. He kind of just cheated on me the entire time and then would turn around and lie about it. And when other people would tell me like, hey, your boyfriend's up to this, or this is what's going on in your relationship and it like is maybe not cool to you, I just didn't see it, or I didn't believe them, or I thought I really had a handle on things. And the truth is I didn't. And that was not the last relationship I've been in that has had elements of abuse, but I do think it kind of set the tone for me normalizing this to myself, because I was in that situation for such a long time that um, I think I desensitized myself to some of the things that were happening and didn't really see that they were detrimental, or things that I did not deserve.
What kind of impact did you see those having those experiences have on your mental health?
That's a good question. I think there are probably so many things that this abusive relationship contributed to my overall character that I don't even know about, like things that are because of this relationship that I don't necessarily associate with being because of this relationship. But I think it made it very difficult for me to trust people. It made it really difficult for me to open up and be vulnerable emotionally, which of course that then kind of just made me internalize a lot of things. Um, I would say it was definitely detrimental to like anxiety and depression, because when you're in these situations and you don't see yourself as being able to get out of them or being able to do something about them, you kind of just like you're in this rut and you tell yourself it's never going to get better. Or maybe you don't deserve for it to get better, and you just can really convince yourself of that. And so I think that's where I lived mentally for a really long time. And it took me really like until recently, a couple years ago, to recognize that none of that stuff was normal. None of it was good for my health, and I didn't deserve to go through any of that. And it's okay for me to kind of move on from it, and try to find myself in a healthier place.
How did you, Nat, start to understand that what was happening to you and what was happening in your relationship was violence?
I didn't come to those conclusions until long after we had broken up. And it was, I kind of knew toward the end, I kind of knew like, I don't like being treated this way. This is irritating to me. But I didn't fully culminate with that idea of like, oh, this is violence, this is abuse, until a few repressed memories from my time with that person kind of surfaced about a year after the breakup. And I remember like walking down the street, I was walking my dog, and like this memory like just hit me full on in the face. And I kind of realized like, oh my God, that was actual like physical violence. And so I remember texting my best friend and being like, hey, like, I remember I told you about this. And I've come to the conclusion that that in fact was like physical sexual violence. Am I being dramatic, or do you agree with this? And she was like, yeah, no, like that's absolutely what that was. But at the time, a couple weeks after it had happened, I had told one of my other close friends about it happening, and they had just said, oh yeah, my boyfriend did that too. And he said he was sorry. So I believe him, and I kind of just, okay, all right. And then I proceeded to repress the memory. So I think when that kind of realization hit me, it gave me the platform to start critically examining some of the other encounters we had and come to the same conclusion that like, yeah, that was beyond just uncool treatment or unjust treatment. That was like absolutely violence.
Nat, when you finally did seek help, what kind of help did you find? And was that a hard step for you to take?
It was such a hard step, but I ended up going to counseling. I did not actually go to counseling for that specifically. It was just one of those things where within some other stories that I was talking about, the thread of that one ended up getting pulled, and my counselor was like, hey, maybe we should take a look at this. And so I ended up talking to a counselor about it. And I definitely feel like there are still things I could talk about with someone. But that first step was really important, because I think we tell ourselves a lot of things about how going to see a counselor is scary, or how admitting you have that kind of damage or that kind of history, like something that you would need to talk to a counselor about, is maybe not a good thing. Like there are so many lies we tell ourselves about seeking help. And the biggest issue for me was like getting over the idea that seeking help was in some way admitting failure, and that in fact it could be a really good thing for me to try to reconcile what had happened by talking about it with someone else.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD Santa Cruz. K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with youth and domestic violence advocate Nick Laughlin, bilingual prevention specialist Ana Velasquez, and survivor and now hotline support volunteer Nat. Stay with us to learn more about the impact of gender-based violence on mental health and about support services and prevention. We'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Family Service Agency of the Central Coast for supporting this program. Family Service Agency provides counseling and support for people of all ages facing life crises and challenges. You can reach them at 423-9444 to see if they can help you. Thank you, Family Service Agency of the Central Coast, for supporting KSQD 90.7 FM.
Now back to our interview. So Nat, I understand now you work helping others who call a domestic violence crisis hotline, people who are going through the same kinds of things that you did. Why did you start to do this kind of work?
I think I started because I was browsing the database that my the volunteer center I work at has one day, and I saw this and I just thought, oh my gosh, this is the perfect fit. Because I really wanted to make sure that no one who was going through what I had been through went through that unsupported. And that if people wanted to seek help, it felt really important to me that because of my experience, I should be someone who is able to kind of offer that help and support. I really firmly believe that absolutely everything happens for a reason, even the bad, difficult things. And so with the things that happened to me, they were like terrible, and I definitely don't wish to relive them, but I do not regret them because I really firmly think that I can use my experience to help others who are in the same situation and feel themselves unsupported or are afraid. And so that's kind of what got me into my hotline work.
So when you answer a call, what kinds of things do you do to try to be helpful? And what do you make sure that you don't do?
It kind of depends on what the caller is calling for. We have people call for a variety of reasons. Some of them really just want like to know about resources in our area. Some of them are like third parties calling because they're worried about like their friend or their sibling who's in a domestic violence situation. And some of them call and they're like absolutely in crisis because like an event just happened. And so what I really try to do, like the hotline training is pretty extensive. So there are like a million ways to answer this question. But what I try to do consistently over every call is provide a safe space for the caller to feel as though they can tell me anything about their situation. And it is safe for them to do so. And that I can help them by offering resources or offering kind of like that mirror where I am able to kind of like bounce their ideas back with them and help them maybe like come to conclusions about what it is they should do. I can offer safety planning. As for what I don't do, I think there's this temptation to be like, you know, when someone's telling you these really horrible stories, I think there's a temptation to be like, oh man, that's awful. I'm sorry. That really sucks. And you can't do that on the hotline, even if you are thinking internally like, wow, God, that's really awful. Because that's not safe. That's not a good way to support someone who's going through it. You kind of have to be like, you're not talking to your friend. You're not gossiping about like what someone's boyfriend did that upset them. Like these are real people who are dealing with serious crises. And so you have to come to them like really level-headed and in a mood to really like be that support, whatever that means for them.
I'm so glad you shared that because I know how hard it is for people sometimes to pick up the phone and make that first call. So I really appreciate that you shared what that might be like for people that would do that. And also who all can call, not just people who are experiencing it, but people who are concerned about them too. Um, I'm wondering, have you seen it make a difference for those calling the hotline, and in what ways?
Yeah, I so because I'm just a volunteer on the hotline, I don't actually get to follow up with clients. They might choose to follow up later with Walnut Avenue or with other resources that I provide them, but I almost always don't get to know what happens to them after our call. I will say there are a lot of people who end the call on a note of like immense gratefulness, and they're like really effusive about thanking me for the work I do. It makes me a little uncomfortable sometimes because it's like, oh wow, like you shouldn't be thanking me. You're going through something really tough, and I'm just here to support you. And it's like sometimes hard to reconcile that these people who are in crisis can then turn around and like be still so um like just so kind to me when they owe me none of that. But I would say like based on the amount of gratitude that I get from people that just feels like really sincere and genuine, I do think making that call can change someone's life or at least change someone's moment of terror.
I'll also add, as someone who works in the office and often sees the people that go on the hotline and then the ones who do show up at the door, it does make a really big difference how they're treated on the hotline. And so we're really grateful to have not only people like Nat, who clearly have a level head and sensitivity towards these things, but also the lived experience piece is important. It makes the work harder, of course, because it touches really close to home, but it also, I think it's an invaluable experience. And a lot of us come to this work because we have lived experience with the topic. And that is such a wonderful example of like making meaning out of trauma. It's not to say that it should have happened, but what can you, the ability to make meaning out of it afterwards, I think is so crucial to healing. And we see that a lot with survivors of like, what can I do with this? And that doesn't mean everyone is a Nat who goes out and, works on a hotline, right? That's not going to be for everybody. In fact, that work is not for everybody. You have to have a very special type of temperament to do that. But what else can you do with that meaning? Like, does it mean you talk to your kids about that stuff? Does it mean you go to therapy? Does it mean that you just live a different life? What meaning can you take from a traumatic experience like that, and integrate it so that you can heal? And I just like, as Nat's talking, it's just making me glow because I'm just like, that is such a wonderful example of like the arc of healing, and that it's not a linear process. And Nat mentioned going to therapy and being like, oh yeah, I probably still have more I could talk about that. But Nat is not where they were. He's not where he was at all. So yeah, just thank you, Nat. Thank you for being such a wonderful volunteer.
Thank you, Nick. That's so nice.
So Nick, while we're talking to you, you're an advocate for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. What have you learned about what stands in the way for people calling a hotline or seeking help for themselves?
I think the biggest one is stigma around abuse, either that certain abuse is acceptable. Like Nat said, hearing his friends say, oh, my boyfriend does that too. And so that immediately forces someone to internalize this as acceptable behavior. Also, certain things are really normalized, like digital stalking has become really normal. It's not considered abusive behavior, especially for young people. A lot of people don't consider emotional abuse. There's also the stigma that they're weak or that they somehow deserve that if they come forward with the abuse that they experienced. There's also so many other reasons, right? Like fear that they won't be believed, especially if the person choosing harm is a model citizen or someone with a lot of power. Or because of the survivor's own vulnerabilities, like mental health issues or substance use issues. There's the lack of culturally competent services or services in specific languages for people. They might be unaware of their rights, especially if they're undocumented or if they're immigrants from another country where domestic violence rights look really different. There are tech barriers, especially due to COVID. We see elderly people not being able to do the Zoom and phone and remote services as easily. So there's just all these barriers. And also, of course, people are afraid to escalate a situation. They're afraid to lose their kids. They're afraid to become homeless because oftentimes, especially if it's a long-term abusive relationship, there's a lot of financial dependence that happens. And to get help puts that at risk. So yeah, I think those are the biggest, kind of some of the biggest reasons we see people afraid to ask for help.
So Nick, if anyone listening might be wondering if they're a victim of violence or in a harmful relationship, what would you want them to know?
I would want them to know that they don't deserve a life of violence, that they deserve a life free from violence and fear. And it doesn't matter what you did beforehand, you just deserve to have a life free of violence. And you have the right to have and state your own opinions freely, to express yourself safely. You have the right to privacy, to support, to be believed, and to know that people like myself, Anna, and Nat believe you. And that getting support for yourself will ripple out and help to heal others. Like if we look at how, Nat's choice to work on their own healing journey is directly helping other people in their community. And that getting help is the best choice that you can make for your kids, for your loved ones, and for yourself. And if you're hearing me talk about these things, like you have the right to express yourself safely, you have the right to your own beliefs and opinions, you have the right to privacy, and you're sensing that you don't have those rights in your relationship, that might be a clue that maybe you should talk to someone. These services are free, they can be confidential, and it can just be a phone call, just to see.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-Squid, community radio for the Monterey Bay. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. And you can find all the podcasts of our shows on Apple and Google Podcasts and on the KSQD website. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with domestic violence survivor and now hotline support volunteer, Nat. Also with us is youth and domestic violence advocate Nick Laughlin and bilingual prevention specialist Ana Velasquez. In this next segment, we'll be focusing on the importance of gender-based violence education, prevention, and advocacy work. I want to remind listeners that every State of Mind episode has a resource list posted on the blog post, and the resources we talk about today can be found on the post for this show at ksqd.org/state of mind. Now let's get back to our interview. Ana, can you describe the kinds of help and support that is available locally for teens or adults who may find themselves in a violent relationship?
Yeah, so for Walnut Avenue, we have a 24-hour crisis hotline in both English and Spanish that anyone, whether it's an adult who is going through a domestic violence situation, a young person who is going through teen dating violence, or even we have had instances of parents calling us because they're experiencing violence at the hands of their teenage children. You know, again, we also get cases of young people calling because they're experiencing abuse by their parents as well. They're able to receive support. They don't have to give their name or any other identifiable information if that makes them feel uncomfortable. And they can talk to somebody to figure out, okay, is what I'm experiencing normal? Or is there something a lot more serious going on? Or what other resources can they tap into? What are my rights? And this is especially important when it comes to young people. Young people sometimes don't really know what their rights are because we live in a world where adults dominate, right? Every decision. And sometimes young people are under the belief or are even led to believe this by the people that are harming them, that there's really no recourse for them because they're young people and nobody's going to take them seriously. We are also offer legal advocacy or one-on-one advocacy for both adults and young people.
Can you kind of define what that means, like specifically what that might mean for someone?
So legal advocacy means that if somebody wants to get a restraining order, whether they're a young person who meets the minimum age qualifying criteria for petitioning for one, or an adult, that we would be able to support them in not only helping them out with filling out the paperwork, but also with preparing them for the court, also ensuring that they have at least thought about any coping tools or techniques that they could use when they're in court, because court is terrifying for anybody. Even if you're there as a support person for somebody else, court can be incredibly intimidating, let alone for somebody that it needs to be there in order to request for this mechanism to advance somebody's safety and well-being, right? And the person that is causing them harm is in the same space more often than not. Then we also support them with any follow-up paperwork that they might require. We also provide referrals to other legal resources that they might need. And with adults, oftentimes it's around issues of divorce, custody, etc. For young people, it might be around issues of how can we connect you with a legal resource that can support you in ensuring that your rights are being respected in a criminal process if that's happening and law enforcement was involved, or how can we collaborate with the victim's advocate from the district attorney's office if there's a criminal case going on with either adults or young people. How can we collaborate to fully, more holistically support this person that's involved instead of them getting some support but then not support in some other areas? So if the victims advocates from the district attorney's office, they're very, very good at what they do, but sometimes they aren't able to take into account other practical concerns that us outside of that legal system might be able to better address.
So you really try to provide wraparound services that kind of address all the areas that this issue is impacting in the person's life.
Yeah. And we also provide ongoing advocacy support, meaning that if somebody's coming in and regardless of whether they're in a situation where they're barely coming to terms with the fact that their relationship might be unhealthy or abusive, or they've already recognized that it's abusive and they need to go over their options, whether to stay, to leave, or maybe they've already left, but then the abuse is still ongoing. So we can support them around maintaining safety, both physical and emotional, if somebody is planning to stay in a relationship, because that's a very valid decision that some people make. We will support them in safety planning with them around, okay, well, if things escalate again, what can you do to stay physically safe? But not just that, but also emotionally safe. Because staying in that kind of situation, especially in the long term, is going to have a very detrimental impact. So how can we set somebody up to have built buffers and barriers to be able to cope, right? For people that are planning on leaving, again, it's incredibly important for them to be talking to a professional around what leaving is going to look like, right? And really planning that out as well as they can possibly plan, because leaving is the most dangerous time for any survivor. During the time that a survivor leaves, that is the most dangerous time for them in an abusive relationship. Oftentimes when you hear cases of intimate partner homicide or a domestic violence homicide, oftentimes this unfortunate event has happened because the abusive partner has figured out that the person that they're harming is thinking about leaving, or they found evidence that indicated that this person is actively working towards leaving. And they can't deal with that, and they unfortunately act in this very unfortunate way.
So at that time, it's so important, I think, to get the message out that that's the time to really make sure that you're well supported.
Yes, not just because of the very real safety concerns, but also because practically speaking, a lot of people, when they're thinking about leaving, there might be things that, when they're in crisis, they're only thinking in the here and now and how can I get through today? And so they're thinking on the very short term without thinking about, okay, what are some things that I need to really consider and make arrangement for that I might need in the long term. So for instance, one of the things that sometimes, people on the hotline will call about, or they will come to us and seek support around, is that they just up and left, but they left vital documents that they need in order to reestablish themselves. Things like their social security card, birth certificate, passports, things of that nature. And so talking with a professional can help them take those things into consideration and have them in a go bag before things get to the point where they feel like they need to leave immediately. In the case of an adult, if it's a young person, then the process of leaving, right, is going to look a lot more different. And again, that definitely requires the support of a professional, because sometimes a young person might not only have to navigate an unsafe, abusive relationship with their partner, but potentially also having to deal with an abusive relationship at home with the parents as well. And there's also safety concerns that need to be considered in that context.
Nat, I want to come to you. And what's been most helpful to you as a victim of violence in your personal recovery? And what's helped or currently helps you support your mental health?
So I would say that the thing that was most helpful was actually just acknowledging that it happened. I wrote a letter about one of the worst things that happened to me to the person who did it. And it wasn't actually my idea to write the letter. I remember my friend asked me, "Hey, what do you think you would say to this person if you could speak to them again and really address what happened?" And I couldn't really sum it up in words, so he suggested that I should write something. So I did end up writing a really long, like just very visceral, graphic letter with all of my feelings. And then on the night of the anniversary of like what had happened, I read this letter to my friend, and he listened to me read it. And then when I was done, we burned it. And that felt really like one of the first steps to letting go. And I think it was really important that I was able to speak that experience to another person. I had talked about it before with counselors, but it was a little different to be able to like be very safe in my friend's living room and speak about this thing happening, and just know that I was like completely supported in whatever I said or however I had to feel about that. There was a lot of love in that room. And I think that really helped me kind of like deal with what had happened. I would say that now a lot of what has helped me find healing are the things that I feel give me agency over my own body, because I feel like my body has been disrespected, and my mental health has been disrespected by these people who chose to harm. And so I do a lot of things like yoga. I take a lot of walks. These are things that help me kind of reclaim that space as my own and feel at home in my own body. The other thing is, as a transgender person, I have been looking into a lot of like gender affirming care, like starting hormone replacement therapy and attending, facilitating really a transgender and non-binary peer support group where I can talk to other people who are also transgender and have had the same experiences I've had. And I feel like that has helped me probably the most in being able to reconcile like everything that happened to me, and then being able to say like, no, I have agency over myself now.
I'm wondering, what do you wish you had known? Like, what do you know now that you wish you had known as a teen about getting help? And what would you want other teens to know?
I wish that I had known so many things. One of them that really sticks out is that you're not too strange or too weird or too anything to seek help. Like, I think there's this narrative, if you're a transgender or non-binary person, or a minority of any sort, like someone who's in the LGBTQ community, or just really any minority, I think there's this narrative that like you deserve what happens to you, or that you're weird, that you're some type of you don't conform to society in some type of way. And so anything that happens to you is explicitly your fault because you are different. And that is so far from the truth. Nobody deserves these bad things that happen to them. Nobody deserves to exist with violence being enacted upon them. And so I think I would say, like, if something is happening to you in your relationship as a teen or as an adult even, and it doesn't feel right, or it feels like it could be violence or abusive in some way, you don't deserve for those things to happen to you, and you aren't too weird to ask for help. I think another thing I wish I would have known is that it is frightening to take those steps toward getting help, but you feel so much better once you do it. And that is something I wish I had known at the time.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD K-Squid. Many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with youth and domestic violence advocate Nick Laughlin, bilingual prevention specialist Ana Velasquez, and survivor and now hotline volunteer Nat. In this next segment, we'll be discussing the role stigma plays in perpetuating gender-based violence and about the supports and resources available. Stay with us to learn more, and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Walnut Avenue Family and Women's Center for supporting State of Mind. Walnut Avenue Family and Women's Center provides no-cost, confidential, strength-based language and gender-inclusive services for families, women, and children in Santa Cruz. More information is available at wafwc.org. That's wafwc.org. Thank you, Walnut Avenue Family and Women's Center, for supporting community radio. K-Squid, 90.7 FM.
Now back to our interview. Nick, I want to come to you because in preparing for the interview, you also mentioned that all the programs at Walnut Avenue are for youth are trauma informed. And I'm wondering if you could describe what that means and how that impacts the work you do.
So trauma informed means that first and foremost, we acknowledge the impact of trauma on development, behavior, and emotional capacity. Trauma shows up in different ways in behavior. And instead of asking what's wrong with this kid, it's more about what has happened. And what can we do to mitigate these behaviors? And our services aim to model appropriate behavior and regulation. So we practice self-care to show up as our best selves, and we help kids do the same. It's really important that we help children understand how to learn to self-regulate, and that every kid's at a different place in learning how to do that. And we don't yell or punish. We create limits and rational and natural consequences. And we explore alternatives to inappropriate behavior because we know that trauma responses show up in all of these different ways. And we focus on the strengths of children instead of, again, what's wrong with them. We focus on these are the things you're doing well, and how can we foster that? And we know that we're not the experts of their lives. They are. And we also, this is really important, we acknowledge that trust with children is earned over time. It's not guaranteed. Children don't owe us trust because we're adults who are showing up to them. We have to be consistent. And I think it's healthy to model to kids that trust is something that's earned. And we acknowledge that cultural backgrounds might impact how kids and their families might relate to us, especially if we're seen as being part of the system. So we're just really aware of that. And we're consistent in our behavior and expectations because we know that we might be one of the only consistent things going on in a child's life, especially if they're in a domestic violence home. And we try to avoid re-traumatizing them. And sometimes that's really subtle. Sometimes that means avoiding slamming doors and that kind of stuff. And we practice connection before correction because we understand that a child, just like an adult, can't hear you if they're flooded. So we try to really practice connecting with a child before we correct their behavior. And we also understand that this is a long-term thing. Prevention is a long-haul effort. It's going to take a long time for us to see the outcomes of our work. Because we know that it's a bottom-up situation. We know that norms change when children change them, and they grow up and they change the norms of adulthood. So, we practice all of these things and we integrate healthy relationship skills and knowledge into our conversations. We model appropriate behavior, and we have a real emphasis on self-care. And that's, I guess, what we mean about being trauma informed.
Nick, I understand you also organized a teen art show called The Art of Violence Prevention. Can you talk about that project and how it's making an impact for teens in terms of prevention and advocacy?
Yeah, so the show, The Art of Prevention, basically, we have been trying to get into schools to do workshops on healthy relationships for a very long time, and it's very difficult to get into schools. So I found a workaround, which is to go directly to art teachers and ask, hey, can I give your students this presentation on healthy relationships and teen dating violence? And can your students make art in response to that? And can we share that art? And the teachers loved it. This was in the time of COVID. Things were a little all over the place. And everything was over Zoom. And I think it was nice to have a change of pace, to have someone maybe help lesson plan a little bit. And so the aim of the art show was twofold. It was one, to educate teens on healthy relationships and teen dating violence, and two, to uplift youth voices on the topic by getting young people to make their own art in response to the topic of teen dating violence. And we know that young people are the experts on their lives. We're just trying to inform that expertise so that they can go confidently through the world with safety in mind for themselves and others. And like I said before, prevention is a really long haul effort. We know that it's making a difference because we got some disclosures, which is a really big deal, that they felt safe enough to tell us, and that they felt safe enough to talk to their teachers about it. And what we really got was these teens looking at and examining their relationships and their relationships with others. And I like I mentioned earlier, I believe it's a ripple effect. It just takes one 16-year-old to say to their friend, hey, I noticed this dynamic in your relationship and I'm worried. Or, hey, like in a healthy relationship, your boyfriend doesn't ask for all your passwords. It just takes one kid to do that, to say that to another kid. And that makes a really big difference. Young people feeling empowered to have safe relationships and be safe to others is going to create a safer community. So I feel that something like this, hopefully we can continue to return to do it. We made some strong connections with the teachers in our community. I hope that we can do it again because I think it makes a big difference. I also think it's educating educators as well about what to look out for. So I guess it's a threefold effect of not just educating teens and empowering their voices, but also getting educators in on the loop.
I just want listeners to know that we have a link to that show on the posting too. And I'm assuming, I haven't gotten a chance to look, but I'm assuming the art is there for people to see.
It is, yeah. It's from a few different high schools and it's all different skill levels, different materials used. It was really open-ended because we just wanted to see what they would make. We didn't want to give them too much structure. And also, we understood at the time that things were really, really hard for kids at that point. And we wanted to be as trauma informed in our expectations as possible. So, for some kids, just showing up that day to class was participating.
I love what you did. And even thinking about what Nat said about just being on a walk and suddenly having memories flood up, because my original training was as a expressive art therapist too. And one thing that, I learned from that experience is that sometimes the act of making art just bypasses all of our sort of conscious thoughts and controls, and just this pure kind of expression comes out. I can't help but think that in some ways, the process of being part of that might even have been discovery for people.
That was also something else we were keeping in mind, was not only is it COVID times and is something as simple as making art going to be helpful for a lot of kids, but also is it going to help them kind of explore not only their own history, but their feelings. We do use an evidence-based art healing curriculum called A Window Between Worlds. And that definitely did inspire a lot of this work as well.
I'm wondering if there's anything you'd want to say, Nat, about the role stigma plays when it comes to gender-based violence. Like, are there things that we, myself and other listeners, can do to help change that?
I think listening non-judgmentally when someone discloses to you that they've been through a situation that involved violence or abuse is probably the most important thing, because there is that stigma surrounding, and I spoke about it a little bit earlier. I spoke about how, like, being transgender, there's this kind of discourse going on that you just, if you're transgender or if you're another type of minority, that you deserve the things that will happen to you by default of being weird. And that's not true. But a lot of people do feel that way when they go to disclose. They feel as though they'll be victim blamed or shamed for it somehow, or that people will look at them differently. And so I think when, as a bystander or as someone who's trying to offer support to people who have experienced harm, that non-judgmental creation of a safe space for people to share their experience is instrumental in allowing people to feel like they can speak on it.
So Nat, do you have any closing thoughts or advice you want to offer our listeners?
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate that no matter who you are or how you identify or how you come into this world and choose to take up space here, you do not deserve to be harmed. You do not deserve to be with someone who chooses violence or enacts violence or harm or abuse upon you. And I would like to say that I know getting help is really difficult, and I know this from experience. But like Nick said, it is absolutely the best thing you can possibly do. And it does require immense courage and bravery, but I would really just emphasize that taking that step to get help is the best possible outcome.
This is Deborah Sloss, and I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Nick Laughlin, Ana Velasquez, and Nat. And thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. To hear more conversations about mental health and wellness, join us on the first Sunday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. right here at K-Squid, 90.7 FM. Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzikowski for audio production and to Jennifer Young, who assists with research and outreach. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. You can find all the past episodes of this show on our ksqd.org website by typing State of Mind in the search bar, or subscribe and get them delivered directly to your listening device on either Apple or Google Podcasts. Or listen through your home smart speaker just by saying, play State of Mind with Deborah Sloss on TuneIn. If you like this or any previous State of Mind episodes, please help the shows get heard by more listeners by leaving us a rating and a review on Apple and Google Podcasts. Or submit your comment at the bottom of the post for any episode at ksqd.org/State of Mind. This is listener-supported community radio, KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. Now, stay with us.